India has just presided over a very successful G20 summit. The thrust of this grouping has been on economic development. And among the prominent declarations we saw post the summit was the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor and Biofuel Alliance, which have now taken center stage and the centerpiece perhaps. How much of an impact can G20 have on the world's economic fortunes?
Thank you very much, Maria, for having me, and a very good evening to viewers. Maria, if you look at the Delhi Declaration, to me, I think it's a very important diplomatic victory for India. In the world of diplomacy, I think the Delhi Declaration will be looked at as a discontinuity, a positive discontinuity, where India's stature in the world, Committee of Nations actually goes up substantially after this G20 presidency. Because, by going back to the basics, if you would recall, the G20 was a gathering that had been created after the global financial crisis to deal with economic matters. And what India did was to actually go back to that basics, focus on the economic aspects rather than, get caught up in the political aspects, and thereby was able to bring this unanimity. And I think that is a very important victory for India's diplomacy. Now, when it comes to the economic aspect, G20, as I just mentioned, is primarily for furthering economic objectives. Here, the corridor, I think, will be very important. And in my opinion, actually, this is the new Silk Route. You would all remember. In history, we've learned about the old Silk Route, which operated from 2nd century to about 15th century, and was, primarily responsible for tremendous prosperity that was brought, into India through trade. I've covered that in the economic survey as well, how India accounted for at least 1/3 of world's GDP consistently up until the 18th century. And now, and a good part of that was trade. What this particular corridor will do is to really enable trade at a time when the sort of pushback against globalization, against trade has been substantial. And I think this will really help in that context. Apart from that, also the focus on the public digital infrastructure,
That's right.
Financial inclusion, both of which India has already done, and demonstrated to the world. Now India gets positioned uniquely as the leader, as the digital leader of the world, and also the leader of creating public digital infrastructure.
Yes, that point that you made about financial inclusion, will you now say that a more globally interdependent world is the new order rather than the hegemony of a few?
Yes, but I would introduce a nuance as well. People have always, at times like these, have talked about, a more connected world, etc. At different points. The important nuance to keep, in mind here is that for the first time, possibly now, both at the level of countries, but also at the level of population within countries, the weaker, segment actually gets its voice. And this can be seen, in the African Union actually getting a membership in the G20. And I think it is important to remember, Maria, here that while there was a lot of talk about how, Africa needs to be actually, given recognition, etc., it was all talk so far for 15 years. That talk has been converted into work by India by actually, including the African Union in the G20 and making it a G21. That is at the country level, thereby giving voice to the, hitherto not as strong. At the same time, the public digital infrastructure, and India has demonstrated it really well. What it does is actually make growth inclusive. We did this during the, pandemic, having been part of the government at that time. I can tell you actually it was a big tool in India being able to come out of the pandemic, with a very strong recovery. Now, this will actually become a tool for many of the developing countries to also make growth inclusive by building public digital infrastructure. So both at the country level through the inclusion of the African Union and public digital infrastructure that actually will make growth more inclusive. This is really a way for the hitherto not so heard to actually, have their voice heard in global fora.
And the fact that the 3 Fs, food, fuel, fertilizer, Now, this is the way forward in terms of deciding the security of all these aspects. In such a scenario, how do you see the world economic order shape? And Mr. Subramaniam, do you think India will have an important role to play? Will the world now be less dependent on the US?
So here as well, I want to bring in an important nuance, Maria. If you think about it as in a counterfactual manner, suppose, let's say, given the same global situation, which is the war, and post-pandemic, etc., if the presidency had been with a different country, this emphasis on, supply side factors, food and fuel, food and energy would not have come about. I say that because, having recognized the importance of supply side factors during the pandemic, and the impact that it has on inflation, and having taken the necessary steps, India brought that conviction about the importance of supply side factors, and thereby was able to convince, the rest of the world to actually focus on these factors. A silver lining from the war has been this focus on supply side factors, the kind of negative shocks that come both to food and energy, and thereby create a lot of economic distress. So India, having demonstrated already, the steps that it took, it has really, brought it to light for the rest of the world. It also does, reduce some of the sort of very large influence that the advanced economies have had. And I think here again, India being the president, G20 president, having shown, a sui generis policy response to COVID, very different from the rest of the world, and successfully, demonstrating the impact of that sui generis response, has provided that credibility to show the world that India can be the leader in thinking about these issues and coming up with solutions.
And India, is also today the best performing economy in the bloc, one would say, when we look at the BRICS nations. How do you see the various aspects, particularly to do with the African Union, being part of the G20, India being the voice of the global south? Are these becoming the new counterweight or new blocks that are emerging in post-COVID world, and which is more diverse?
Yes. First, let me, clarify. In my opinion, India is not just the leader, in terms of economic performance among BRICS nations, but is the leader among all the large economies, of the world, with a 7.2% growth last year, which in my opinion, I've written about it as well, will, eventually end closer to 7.5% when the revisions happen, and a 7.8% growth in the first quarter. India is by far the fastest growing economy among all the large, economies in the world. And that is what has also provided India this position to speak from a position, from strength to strength, having done this and having demonstrated, good economic performance. And that really helps in the, in the global community of nations. You cannot sort of bring as much gravitas if you are struggling as an economy. But I think India, having sort of been the bellwether for economic growth now post COVID, clearly, has that strength to be able to, influence other nations positively. And I think that has really helped in bringing the African Union, as I was saying earlier, really becoming the voice of those that hitherto did not have as much voice. And I also included, not just the African Union, but also the relatively poor, vulnerable sections within countries through the use of the digital infrastructure.
Last question to you. You sit on the board of IMF and represent India's interest. IMF has been putting out projections for the world economy and the direction in it is likely to take in the coming years. IMF has been very bullish on India and expects it to grow faster than any other similar large economies, China in particular. How hopeful are you that India will soon be the third largest economy? Second, where do you see Indian economy 5 years from now in terms of size?
So, Maria, I actually would want to mention that even before, a lot of the commentators started becoming bullish on India, there are a lot of people who are now bullish on India. In 2020, after the lockdown quarter,
I remember having conversations with you then, sir.
Yeah, there is going to be a V-shaped recovery. I said that
Yes.
India in the next 2 decades actually will grow at very fast, and at that time, of course, many people didn't believe the bullishness with which I actually projected for the Indian economy. I think now I'm not surprised at all, when so many commentators actually become, bullish on the economy, including, the IMF currently. And I think my own projection is that in the coming 2 decades, baseline growth, and, this is based on a paper that I'm working on, it should be out, in a couple of weeks, we're projecting the growth the potential growth for India. Baseline, in other words, if we don't do anything very different, just continue at the same rates of investment, of growth of investment that we've had over the last decade and productivity over the last 2 decades across different sectors, we should get 7% growth. But if we actually do better, policies are more favorable to investment, to enhancing productivity, we can clock 8% growth as well. So in the next 2 decades, really the demographic dividend can actually fructify for India. And as the Honorable Prime Minister has said, Amrit Kal, from an economic perspective, I genuinely believe that the Amrit Kal is going to be there for the next 2 decades.